This is Restless. It is the end of Winsome Winter, and we are kicking off the end of Winsome Winter here on Restless with Kristin Dumez Week. It's here, everyone. Pastor Michael is about to review Jesus and John Wayne for all of you.
It's been a long time coming, and we're excited to do it.
I am your host, Matt, who does indeed feel like a man, because today I took apart a children's playhouse with a screwdriver in a street so that I could Facebook Marketplace my way home. And we will find out today if that view of my masculinity is problematic.
That is militant masculinity at its core. I'll just say it already.
I even had alternative rock radio on and my kids were in the car. So we there is plenty of psychoanalyzing that could be done. But Pastor Michael, this was a big job for you. And so we thought it would only be right if you were given help in reviewing this.
So we got our friend David. David's back. If you remember, David was with us for at least one episode. I don't know if it turned into two. I don't remember, of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And so David, welcome back, man.
Yeah, thanks for bringing me back. Yeah, when you said you were reading this book, I decided to read it out of pity. You know, misery loves company, and I thought you might enjoy some.
Honestly, really do appreciate it, because it was a tough one. I'm just gonna say that right away. I'll try to stay as winsome wintry as I can, but
it's over. It's warm now.
Okay.
It's done.
In that case, it was hard. It was very hard. It was hard to get through. So I appreciate the company.
And we're happy to have David here, because if you remember him from the episode of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, he was a sultan of subtext. He was a colossus of context. He is just great at a really logical analysis of these kinds of ideas and books. And so I think it will be a great conversation with the two of them. Your listener, I am in the joy of sheer ignorance about this book right now. And so I'm excited. We're going to talk about many ways how we cover these kinds of things. We're going to talk about what the writer's goal in the book was, what her thesis was. We'll talk about if there are things we can agree on. Obviously, you aren't listening to this because you assume we're going to give this a glowing review. And then we will talk about what problems might have occurred. And so I'll be here asking them questions, trying to get a handle of what this book is and why this book has shown up everywhere. That's the interesting thing, is its ubiquity in the evangelical world. So guys, take us away. Let's give us in the most broad strokes, what is Jesus and John Wayne about?
Yeah, so maybe I should just say up front, I have 12 pages of notes it's almost typed in paper format, not quite, and it's just quotes and, my thoughts and how I would review it. And they're not maybe perfectly worked out, but I'll probably make that available for patrons in some way. We can put that behind the paywall there so that you can have a bit of that. So there's a lot more than we can possibly say at this time. And I wanted to be thorough, right? Like I wanted, part of it is just how I read this kind of book. Usually I enjoy reading books from a differing perspective. But I wanted, especially with this one, seeing all the controversy around it, I wanted to know, okay, I've got the receipts for what I think it's saying, why it's saying this.
And it's a long book, correct?
It was a long book. It was longer than I was expecting. I don't remember the exact detail. I read it on Apple Books. So it was, it was kind of it changed depending on the size of the font I made it and whether I was reading on my computer or on an iPad. And so it would change. So I don't know the exact number, but it's got to be, well over 200 pages.
The hardcover with notes is 368 pages.
Yeah, there are extensive notes,
okay.
End notes. So there's a lot of end notes involved. And so it's a pleasant surprise when you get near the end and you think, oh, this is going to take forever. And then you find out, no, it's actually, we're about done because of the end notes. But anyway, so there's only so much that we can do. But in kind of entering into it, how I would break down what I think the main reason for the book, and I'll read what I believe the thesis statement of the book really is. But I think the main reason that this book was written is it was an attempt to figure out why evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. This is kind of very core to the message. And so this is even, something that she asks in the introduction to the book. And this is where I believe this is the thesis statement of the book. So this is in the introduction. She says at one point, evangelical support for Trump was no aberration. It was rather the culmination of evangelicals' embrace of militant masculinity, an ideology that enshrines patriarchal authority and condones the callous display of power at home and abroad. So this is front and center. How could these people support Donald Trump? In the wake of the Trump era, how could this be a thing? Well, it's because of these ideas of militant masculinity that were already there, already working themselves out. And then she does kind of historical analysis of these things coming about.
So she is explaining in what you're saying. Obviously, she, like everyone else, is panicked as all people are, and to some degree, at what has come to the polarization of America. And she's looking at both the history and beliefs that kind of have allowed evangelicals to, in her mind, just be so hard in with Trump. If I'm restating that accurately.
I think so. David, what do you think?
Yeah, David, tell us if you can differ, as much as you want.
You're welcome to differ.
But yeah, how would you describe, if someone asks you, David, you read this book, what is it about? What is it, what's the point of it?
Yeah, I do think it's large. It is a large. It's largely it's not a theological book. It's mostly a book about sociology, but sociology to the end of explaining politics, and especially Donald Trump, like you said. I also think you're seeing a redefinition of the word evangelical. I've heard this bandied about by Mark Knoll and a couple other people, that whereas prior to 2016, evangelical was largely defined theologically in terms of beliefs, centered on the cross and a born again experience, the standard evangelical, explanations of what it is to be an evangelical. It never really meant a lot. It was always very vague, but I was always theological. Whereas now people are tending to describe evangelicals more culturally, more socially. And this book, I think, is kind of a historical. I don't think she makes it unhistorical apologetic for that, but it ends up being that. This is why we can now, or this is like, it's worthwhile to now talk about these groups of people culturally and sociologically as opposed to theologically. Though she does try to. When I say it's not theological, she never really cites beliefs or scripture or creeds or confessions. She will cite people who are popular in the evangelical world and say that's theology. But from my point of view, that doesn't cut it as theology.
Right.
Sound bites from Jerry Falwell's not.
Yeah, she does though. I mean, so she does. I would argue that she's ambiguous. So she multiple times does bring up, this is evangelicalism should be seen more as like a social cultural kind of movement. However, she does in those contexts even often say, but it should not be completely unmoored from the doctrine or belief systems that underlie it. She's just going to seemingly argue that these things don't come, or maybe a better way to put it is she implicitly tries to argue. In some places, it becomes a little more explicit, where she contrasts certain beliefs about, who Jesus is. Is he the conquering king? This is in the introduction again. Is he, the conquering king, or is he like this, the suffering lamb? Or I can't remember how she puts it exactly, but she contrasts these things as if, hey, maybe these are, completely different views of Jesus. So these things come in. They definitely bleed in, like theological, biblical issues bleed into what she's saying. And she does believe that they somehow undergird some of the evangelical movement, but also she does try to, move it away from that. And obviously, like you said, she doesn't do like deep, here's this biblical analysis, except, again, a couple points where she jumps in with just well, what about where the Bible says this, just as an offhand thing, which I don't know what you do with that.
I think one thing that David said that I think is potentially important, whether or not you like the book, is that the redefinition of what it means to be an evangelical, I think is upon us. Right. This is why when you hear someone describe themselves as an ex-evangelical and you go, oh, what does that mean? Do you mean you don't believe in a born again experience? Do you not believe in the inerrancy of the Bible? They probably don't believe in those, but they're like, well, I was at my church and they were racist. And it's and to a person who,
wait, there's sinners at church? I don't get it.
Yeah. They're sinners.
Not at our church, but I've heard that is a thing.
Okay.
But it's this strange, like, they describe all these cultural issues or interpersonal problems, and they go, and that's why I'm not an evangelical. And I go, okay, well, let's make sense. Maybe that explains why you left a church or a denomination, but evangelical isn't really defined by any of those things. And I think that is what it is largely becoming defined as. I think in the South, right, I often talk about like roll tide evangelicals, because what I'm trying to get at is that just like cultural Christianity has always existed, there is a culture, there might be some version of a cultural form of evangelical, and that is how it is being used. This would be an interesting thing to talk to our actual sociologist friend about, how much of evangelicalism should just be understood at this point in through a sociological lens. Would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I've actually heard. So I heard, hey, Brad, DM us if I'm wrong about this, but I believe I've heard Brad Vermerlin. This is our sociologist friend that Matt's talking about. I think I've seen him post about basically the idea that, like, when you criticize evangelicalism as this like whole consistent cultural movement, it does not take into account the reality that evangelicalism has never been a singular, like, united movement, but has always been pretty divided in major ways within itself. And he brings that up in his book, right? I mean, that comes up in his book about New Calvinism too. But let me just add quick before we move on, and even some of these issues of like cultural Christianity, I think actually really interesting points that this book makes that we can discuss a little bit about the religious right and some of the influence on the church, and whether that was good or bad, we can discuss. But one thing that I should point out is that this is not a book that is in any way neutral, right? Not that you can be neutral.
Yeah.
But from the very beginning, it becomes clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, David, what was that?
Yeah, there's not even an attempt at neutrality. I mean, it's in the title.
Yep. Right. Absolutely.
Let me read the subtitle for everyone, because this actually gets at the second question I had about this thesis, because it's, I think, important. So the subtitle, just so everyone knows, everyone just talks about it as Jesus and John Wayne. The title is Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. The real concern a human should have when they read that title is she's laying at the feet of American evangelicals the state of the American, like, cultural and political landscape. Dang, that sucks, because it's in a bad place.
Yep.
And two, even worse, if you're an actual evangelical, you've just been accused of corrupting the faith of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, specifically, I just want to correct you. It's white evangelicals.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
That have done all of this.
I'm sorry that I forgot the racial experience. So, but what I wanted to ask you guys about with this thesis is, right, if you look at this book, it was endorsed by Beth Moore. It's endorsed by the writers at Salon, at Vox, at all over. Okay, whenever she's criticized for a view she puts forth in this book, she says, this is a work of history and sociology. Don't criticize me. And when you guys are both saying there is a clear agenda, if the agenda, because of how it's reacted to as an outside looking in, it has to have at least somewhat of a theological agenda, even though it's not a work of theology, or maybe it doesn't. So I'm asking, how does the agenda work? What, because it's supposed to work on evangelicals, and we are people with a set of beliefs. So maybe I'm just not thinking about it right. How does the agenda kind of work through the book? Because she said, hey, you have this kind of a programmatic agenda for the church and for Christians. I'm going to question that by the scriptures. And her response is always, it's a work of sociology and history. Right? That's what I'm trying to put together.
So there's kind of there's a rhythm to the book.
Okay.
The way almost every chapter works is this. She will bring up 2 to 5 historical figures, some of whom could be called theologians. For example, Billy Graham or Jerry Falwell might be considered a theologian. She then she then cites something that they said that was dumb, something dumb that they did, or something nefarious that they did. The nefarious part, that's more suggestive than accusatory. But there's generally something negative put on that person, always towards defending her thesis of white evangelicals corrupting politics, or of an increase of patriarchal chauvinism, or something like that. So the theology comes in that she will quote people who are ostensibly theologians, but then she will also, as part of that, she will then bring in history and say, oh, and this is kind of how it plays out in history at that time. Jerry Falwell says X, then the moral majority does Y, then Ronald Reagan does Z, something like that. Well, I'm just giving that as one example, but every chapter pretty much follows that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I would also say one of the this is part of the what I will call maybe the slippery part of the logic of the book. It is written in a way that there is probably almost always going to be plausible deniability, right? Oh, I didn't say that this view was wrong. I just mentioned it. But it's mentioned in a way, in a context that paints it in a bad light, whether or not it is a good thing. She clearly, from the way she writes it, is writing up certain beliefs within evangelicalism. Some, like David said, are like these crazy, horrible things that some people said or did. And then right alongside of it will be things that are far more innocent or maybe even acceptable historic Christian beliefs. And they are put all together. So this is something I can get to. If you want to do this now, I can. I kind of put it at the end of all of my notes, kind of the more like rhetorical, the elements of this that I think make it a work of propaganda. And like those elements that, the way she frames certain ideas or the way she like implies things without ever maybe fully saying it, so that you can always say, I didn't say that, right? I didn't use the words to say that's a bad thing or this is a good thing. But the way that she writes, it's very clear what she believes.
So if there's an agenda being pushed, it's not so much, right, where people are like, hey, you're kind of attacking the beliefs of the church. It would not be what we'd call a frontal assault. It would be I'm going to say a bunch of things that are going to make you want to distance yourself from Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell. And again, not that any of these, I'm not particularly attracted to any of these figures, but when it's like, they had whatever, they had this really negative view or negative thing they said that was either dumb or nefarious or whatever. Also, they followed the Mike Pence rule, right? Like, and then I got to distance myself from, it's encouraging me to distance myself from probably a lot of things that actually are related to evangelicals. Is that kind of what it would be?
It's exactly that. That's some of it, right? There are several different ways that I would, that I would put it, but that's one of the ways that she clearly frames things in this way. And again, just to make clear that this is like a work of activism, not simply a work of history or something like that. She ends the book, literally the end of the book, ends with the phrase, what was once done might also be undone. She explains that like understanding these things is important to know how we got here so that we can undo it all, right? Like, I mean, this is her purpose, she says at the end in writing the book, is to be able to undo basically what the, religious right and these militant masculine Christian nationalists have done to everything, the church and the nation.
When I write a book of sheer history, I say what was once done in the founding of a country can be undone, right? That you're obviously moving beyond history. So before we go further down this road, I mean, we've got to do it because you guys are doing a review. What is there? We'll start with David. What is there that's either positive or right, or something that is we can agree with on some level?
I've been thinking about that. It's kind of hard to put into words.
Sure, I'm sure it is.
Now, I think the most positive things you can take from the book might be the things that she puts forward as negative. In other words, it's one of those things where you can learn from people that don't like you, or you can learn from people who may not have your best interests at heart. So one of the things that she does is I will give her kudos on her cleverness. She does some mental aikido or jujitsu or judo, in that she's been in evangelical culture long enough to know that for a lot of evangelicals, there's always, they want to follow the figure. You talk about Mark Driscoll. How many people ended up leaving Christianity or just becoming non-committal, non-attenders because Mark Driscoll, his church went down in flames.
Sure. Yeah.
And so by her tactic of always bringing up an evangelical leader and saying, look at the nasty thing this person did, look at the nasty thing they said, she doesn't have to directly critique evangelicals themselves or their beliefs, but she accomplishes the same purpose because she's taking down the heroes. She's taking them down a notch. So one thing that I think evangelicals could really get is just don't do that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You don't follow Mark Driscoll. You don't follow Billy Graham. You don't follow Jerry Falwell. And of course, you want to say something generic, like you want to follow Jesus, but more concretely, I think this is where having a solid confession, having a solid beliefs on actual doctrine is what evangelicals need to emphasize, as opposed to what John MacArthur said or what whoever else said whatever. So that's, I think, a real positive.
I think that's true.
That is a really good point, and I think is a really helpful point, because even if you think about how evangelicals have done theology, where they tried to do that, it was like, use Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, and everyone's like, that's a great idea. What's the problem with that? It's still a theology written by a guy, right? No matter how good or bad you think he is, it's still, like you're saying, David, it's what Wayne Grudem said. And that's not theology, because now when you have questions about things Wayne Grudem says, now you go, well, what do I think about everything else, right? You begin to question it. But if you have that, as you're saying, these objective doctrinal creedal statements, that's much better. Michael, what were you going to add about that?
Yeah, well, it's just true. So when you peg yourself to one person, the reality is that people are sinful and they're going to do sinful things. And so that comes across very clearly in the book. I would say that this is an area that, it makes it a compelling work in the sense of this could make it a very compelling book if you simply read it as here are a bunch of examples of really popular evangelicals doing stupid things or wicked things, right? Being caught in sex scandals or what have you, or Christian organizations growing to massive sizes where they are doing hundreds of millions of dollars in sales every year, and nobody's hey, maybe this is going to cause problems for us, not just be good. That she has plenty of examples of bad things that have been done by evangelical leaders over the course of the last 60 years. And so when you see those things, it is a good reason to remember, hey, your faith shouldn't be based on one person. You should, question things. You should focus far more on personal piety in a local church that you can serve in with a clear confession of beliefs, rather than, hey, there's this guy, that I am going to follow. There's this, this guy, Jerry Falwell, that I see on the TV, and he's like my guy, right? This Billy Graham, he's my guy. This, this Ted Haggard, he's like, he's really what's good, right? Like he's what's good about the church.
Man, we get Ted Haggard back. Ted Haggard comes out.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Oh man. Like when you have this guy and you're like, wow, he's amazing. He's my guy. And then you find out that he was seeing male prostitutes. Like, it's like, okay, well, like your whole faith is gone because your faith was not in the truth of what is revealed in scripture about who God is and what Christ has done. It is in a guy,
Yeah, I can't think of a single evangelical scandal of the past 60 years that did not show up in the book.
Wow.
They're all there.
Yeah, all of the major events, and even some of the more minor things, right? Like even some of the more minor things were there. Now, let me say, like this is again one of those areas that I think becomes an element of a kind of propaganda, because if you just read this, you're like, man, evangelicals are the worst. And if you compared this to simply like the political scales of like political leaders on both left and right, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter who, you would see that actually this is a pretty small list that you could fit it in, this size of a book. And even all the names that are mentioned are not necessarily people that were involved in scandal. Again, we'll maybe get to some examples of where she lists people alongside each other who really should not be listed alongside of each other. But like when you hear these things, maybe it's just because I'm insulated and in completely different circles, but I'm like, oh man, yeah, like a lot of these people, they were hugely popular for a while, but I don't see, continuing popularity in these circles. I see some healthy response of at least some, what I would consider evangelicals saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this hero worship stuff. But I don't know. Hey, I've got some other things too.
Yeah. What else is positive
that I think is positive? Maybe with the hero worship, she does point out some problems that clearly arose with the overlap of evangelical belief and their belief about the role of the civil government. So like what I would call like Christian state worship, this kind of, focus on politics that was, I think, overall pretty negative because it was everything, so the faith became intertwined with a particular way of doing politics, so much so that, the evangelical church becomes a major voting bloc. Now, even when I say that, if you read the book carefully, you'll find that even she says, actually, they didn't play that major of a role in electing any of these presidents or, like actually doing any of the things that she kind of criticizes them for being a part of. However, it does point out the reality that people got themselves entangled in the, civil government in a way that it was like, this pastor, instead of preaching on Sunday, is talking about who you should be voting for or the kinds of like political activism you should be doing. That's a problem, like that's a problem that we see and we talk about a lot today, even on our podcast for maybe a more like progressive side of things, right? A social justice bent. This is something that was happening from maybe a more conservative point of view. And we should own that. We should recognize that and say, yep, that was not overall helpful.
Okay. Before we go to perhaps what everyone is most excited about from Pastor Michael's Good, Bad, and the Ugly, though unfortunately not a John Wayne film, genre.
I couldn't think of a good like name for a review that would also be a John Wayne film. So
is there anything else positive or agreeable? I think it would be an interesting way to read the book, as David said, though, as a strict like, okay, what you don't like, let me think about what I might learn from there. Because Michael, didn't you have the example of something about like, I think we recorded this in an episode where Lifeway was criticized for carrying a book by R.C. Sproul and a convert to Christianity from Islam while they were de-shelving Whose book?
I think it was Rachel Held Evans or
Rachel Held Evans. Yeah.
I think that's who it was. Yeah.
And
so
how
Lifeways
hypocritical that was.
criticized. Right. Yeah. How could they do that? Now, included in that also is like, I think, is it Todd Starnes? Is that his name? Is that
sure? Yeah.
So he wrote like
Fox
a pro-Trump book that was in, these bookstores at the same time. And so it's like, yeah, okay. But here's where that framing comes in. And you're going to see this time and time again. It's look at all these things that are the same, so how horrible of them to like delist this book about, Christian feminism, while at the same time they carry this horrible Trump book and this book that talks about the problems within Islam from a Christian perspective. It's like, well, that's not the same thing. But the fact that you list them alongside each other as if they're the same thing, like that in itself is trying to get you to believe something that is not necessarily the case. That happens, we did this before too in the introduction. She just lists all these, positions that evangelicals hold, such as being like, they're more likely to support, I think it was like torture and, like the death penalty, as if those two things are on the same level. Well, one of those is commanded by God in the Bible, whether or not you say that has to apply in the exact same way today, like you have to say, well, God commanded the one and the other has always been a sin and wrong, no matter what. And so to put them alongside each other, that tells you that the author is trying to skew what you do, to skew how you react. Because what I'm going to do, and what most people will do, is say, oh no, like torture is bad. Oh no, like those people who were saying yes, even though we see all of the atrocities in the Vietnam War, we think we should go even harder. Like we should just keep pushing. This isn't that big of a deal. I'm going to say, oh man, that is a problem. And then you take that and flip it into, well, then you also have to see it being a problem that evangelicals believe that men should be strong and protect their families. Wait a minute, like those are not the same thing.
Right.
But if you're not careful, if you're not discerning, you might just jump right in and be like, I guess she's right that these things are bad. I have to agree.
Yeah. Yeah. So because we could do a very long review, we'll have to limit you guys to the negatives. David, yeah, what is the bad? What is the and I know that might be the broadest question I could possibly ask.
It's so hard.
It is. It's how can I the bad is, although it's a historical and sociological account by her own admission, it is bad history, and I think it is bad sociology.
Interesting.
And I think she inadvertently gets causality wrong.
Huh.
She makes the cause the effect and the effect the cause.
Okay, can you give us an example of that? That sounds interesting.
Yeah. So the easiest example of that, let me think. I just said it's obvious, so I should have one right on the tip of my tongue. She puts, so let's take the biggest ones. The biggest one, white evangelicals fractured a nation. Okay. And so what's posited is that white evangelicals, this group of people, inject all of this controversy and all of this stuff into national politics because they are from a position of power. Okay. When in reality, the way I would read history is these people are reacting to a loss of power that they've already experienced. And they're not causing a change in the politics, a change in the power structures. The change in the power structure has caused them to lose power, has caused them to lose jobs, has caused them to lose influence. And these are people desperately trying to maintain a way of life and a faith. If we're gonna bring faith into the evangelical stuff, not the stuff to that definition. So she reads it backwards. They didn't cause anything, and to a large degree, things happened to them, and that's what's being played out currently in politics. That really is how I read the Trump phenomenon. Yeah. Trump was not pushed forward by evangelicals. Evangelicals were basically in a fit of desperation, saying, "This guy is an outsider. He might actually do something different from the last 5 guys or gals that we voted for." who did either nothing or the exact opposite of what they said. That's the Trump phenomenon.
I think that's a lot closer. I mean, we've said it between ourselves. We've said it on the show, David. You obviously know evangelicals. My experience is pretty much all evangelicals were pretty reluctant to vote for him, but said on some reasoning close to you. Now, obviously, there's Trump culty people out there that, you know, do believe things that are a little bit crazy. But I mean, is that your experience? You're in a very different place than us. You're in the South, so maybe it is different. Is the experience there similar, that there are certain things about him that that made people reluctant, but for the reasons you're describing, we've got to do something, kind of an ideal?
Yeah. So, I mean, I put them into, I've seen like 4 types of Trump voters.
Okay.
One is just people who just pull Republican lever.
Sure.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Yep.
Trump's a Republican. Got it. So that's one. 2 would be the people who reluctantly said, I want something different. He's different. Yes, he's crass. Yes, he's crude. Yes, he doesn't support my values, or he doesn't live my values, but I'm going to vote for him anyway because nobody else does either.
Yep.
There's a third group of people I'm going to call the trolls. They're mostly like that second group, but they just like to get hot takes on Twitter, and they like to rub it in the noses of you know, this is the own the libs crowd.
Right.
Okay. Yep. And then there's the crazies, and they're the smallest by far population. The first 3 is the vast majority of people who voted for Trump, and that's the vast majority of people I've seen.
Okay. Yeah. And I actually think this problem you're describing, obviously, if her thesis is that white evangelicals fractured the nation, and if you're saying, hey, they're actually reacting to a fractured nation, and even if you can posit negative examples of them reacting to that, that's fine, right? They probably did react negatively sometimes because, as you put it earlier, there are sinners in the church. Things were going wrong in their life and in country and potentially even in their churches, and they also handled it poorly sometimes. That's not a shock, right? That's not a very noteworthy thing, because it would be hard to identify any affinity group in America that hasn't handled the fracturing we're all experiencing in a negative way, at least sometimes. Michael,
yeah, I mean, especially a group that feels desperation.
Yeah,
that's another note. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and this is where when she singles out white evangelicals, I have to wonder: is there any other group that feels desperate that she would feel comfortable doing this kind of a book on?
Yeah,
my guess is no.
Mm-hmm. This is the point, and I've said it before. This is the sympathy I have for these people, right? When Michael and I have seen some of these rallies that have kind of charismatic or really out there speakers, or, you know, these kinds of
blowing the shofar,
blowing the shofar.
Yeah. That was the worst.
Blowing the shofar to save the election.
Yeah. It didn't work, by the way.
It didn't work. If you thought that was going to work, hey, it didn't work. And this is a wake-up call for you.
Yeah, it's a great reason to not trust in the shofar anymore.
Yeah. But what I think is, when I see that, obviously there are things to be laughed at. Obviously it's wrong, it's misguided, it's foolish. But I think you're right. This is the only group where it's like, we have no reason to have sympathy for people. And what I see is, these are sheep without a shepherd. And in fact, the people who could shepherd them call them, they're the worst. They're the problem. They are, right, that this kind of view you're talking about. These are people who actually need shepherding, and they're not getting it. And so they find Shofar Man and all of his friends, you know, willing to kind of fill in that gap. And obviously, Not well.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. So one of the things that I noticed in the book, there were certain points where I specifically thought it when she was speaking about James Dobson. So Dobson figures pretty prominently in the book. And it was interesting to see how, you know, right alongside the like serious breakdown in the family that was happening culturally and societally, she points out that all of a sudden, in this new time, she doesn't point necessarily to the breakdown in the family as causing this, but I thought that all of a sudden this guy, James Dobson, becomes really popular for sharing things like, hey, this is how you discipline your children. This is how you help your children if they're having trouble in school. This is this is how you talk to your children about sex. It's all these things that in probably a healthy society, you just get from being around and being raised by, parents who train you and your grandparents who are around, and you're raising your kids around them and they help you. And there's with the breakdown in community in our country, which happened both in and outside of the church, all of a sudden what people desire becomes different. What they where they can find leaders is no longer in my local church, because the community in that region is broken down to such an extent that they just don't normally do that, but they are watching the TV. And so these guys that come on, they're naturally going to have some authority in how they speak, because they're the ones that are actually speaking to them. They're right there. They're present in the home in a sense, in a way that others are not. And I'm not saying that that's all good. It's just that is the actual, I think, interesting reason why some of these people became really prominent, and why when they start talking about issues of gender, it becomes this, she very much reads into the motives of people, that they, there was this deep insecurity about their masculinity. And so a lot of men within the church began to overcompensate by, proclaiming these truths about what masculinity was, that for somehow she doesn't talk about, what happened before the Cold War, or before, she really starts around just after World War II. But
which is when the evangelicals rose up, right? That is the rise of modern American evangelicalism, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So it makes sense that she might start there talking about evangelicals, but it does make it sound like, before this, Christians were all egalitarian, and before, the end of World War II, there were so many female CEOs, and women were serving in the military. And then all of a sudden the evangelicals came along and said, these are all really bad things that shouldn't happen anymore. And that was a reaction from insecure men. But that's obviously not at all what was true.
This is important, because I think so. The negative point David brought up is devastating to the thesis of the book, right? If the causality is reversed, this thesis just fails. Michael is bringing up the negative thing that when we heard this interview on the rise and fall of Mars Hill, I literally couldn't believe what I was hearing. That during the Cold War, the ideal of the protective male rose up. And I was like, who wrote this and thinks this? And I realized it was Jesus and John Wayne.
Yeah, so it's a whole book.
Is it really presented? And I'm going to just talk to you. Is this, both of you, is this real? Is that really the point? That these ideas of masculinity are 1950, because the idea of a man as a protector, I don't even know how to help you if you've read classical literature, or just go to pick any time period and read a major work from it, and you'll find this idea. And again, I'm not saying that all of them are good, not that they're all good versions of this. This is as close to natural theology as you get, a belief held by all people in all times and all places, right? We're as close to that as we can get with this. But is this, why don't you bring this up? So Michael, David, what is this? What does she think is unique? And this is obviously probably a bad thing. What is she trying to get at with this idea of masculinity in the book?
So this is part of the thesis, right? This is the problem of militant masculinity that rises up and becomes dominant, and the idea of the patriarchy that's tied to white Christian nationalism. And all these words are all they're all basically operating as synonyms, with slight variation throughout the book. But one of the primary issues, one of the biggest, bad things in our category of bad in this book, is the clear view that comes across of gender, of men and women, and what men and women are and what they look like. Now, again, one of the things that I would say is that like she has plenty of examples of really stupid, ham-fisted things that people have said about the roles of men and women, over the last 60 years. There's some really bad things out there. Okay. And almost everybody that she quotes, I have quotes from, all these people, she quotes, pretty heavily from, again, in this area, Dobson. She quotes a lot from John Eldridge. She quotes some from Doug Wilson. She quotes from all kinds of different people. And half of the quotes, I'm like, this is actually just pretty standard historic Christian understanding, natural understanding of the roles of men and women. And then the other half, it's like, oh yeah, that was a really stupid thing to say or a stupid way to say it. And so it's not as though it's just straightforward and obvious all the time, but she clearly has a negative view of what we would simply say is the historic belief that, men are, made to be in a position of authority in the home, in the church, in a way that women are not, that men are made to do things like, be to like go to war, like fight, right, to protect, like these ideas. She very often throughout the book brings up, again, in context of here are some of these crazy bad things that these people have said. She brings up how negative some of these people were about women serving in the military, right? How it was this like, really like kind of wild thing that evangelicals would be so up in arms about wanting to allow women to join the military. And, she points out that like the Center for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, they come out with this statement about why women shouldn't serve in the military and how that's just this, like, it's painted as this really negative thing. Again, that we would just say historically, like the historic Christian view on this is clear, it's obvious, and it would be in full agreement to that. Like it's a tragedy if women are serving in the military.
It's just the corollary of put the women and children in the lifeboats first. That's all that is. That's all that is that. So David, tell us about this, in my mind, ahistorical kind of analysis of gender or just what she's getting at with this stuff.
Yeah. So the only way you can make the case that this bad complementarian, bad gender stuff started in the Cold War is by reading history poorly. So what you will notice throughout the book, as the book progresses, you see more and more people citing more and more things that she can paint as negative or not egalitarian. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, why didn't the people at the beginning of the book talk about that? Because the traditional gender roles were both accepted and acceptable, and they felt no need to do it. So, of course, Billy Graham in the 1940s and 50s doesn't talk much about it. Sure. Of course, Doug Wilson talks more about it in the 2000s. So what you've seen is not you haven't seen a people that has become more militant, I don't think. You've seen a people that has tried to maintain prior beliefs and prior roles. And so there's a divergence for sure, but the evangelicals are not causing it. Yeah. It's a reaction to what's going on.
Yeah. And this comes out time and time again, that again, she is not operating from like a neutral playing field. So I just want to give like a couple of examples that are just, seemingly like innocent on their face, but like when you actually look at it, you're like, oh, this is actually problematic. At one point she's talking about the different ways that more conservative politically people, being led by guys like James Dobson and others, might view the role of a parent versus those who are more liberal. And she says, whereas liberals favor a nurturing parent model, conservatives embrace a strict father metaphor for their parenting. Even in that line, do you hear that? Like she can't bring herself to say mother for like the more caring, the more nurturing. So a nurturing parent role. Whereas like, what, the conservatives want is this harsh father role. She speaks about the conservative resurgence in the SBC and kind of the history of the SBC. She makes it sound, by the way, like, you know, the SBC was conservative and evangelical. And, you know, then this like resurgence was actually this kind of militant, masculine, Christian nationalist like wing kind of taking over, rather than that the denomination had slid into a much more kind of theologically progressive position and was now coming out of that. And I don't have, I'm looking for the quote, but she basically says at one point, she talks about kind of the two sides and how, you know, those on the conservative side had a very, you know, literalistic and biblicist reading of the text, whereas the women on the other side of the issue were just simply trying to carefully exegete the, you know, whatever the passages were, rather than, you know, this direct kind of literalism. So the way that she paints these things here, I think that I hopefully found it. She said, these women insisted, talking about specifically the women who were interpreting passages of the Bible in an egalitarian way and arguing within the SBC that there should be, you know, female pastors. So this is this is going back to the conservative resurgence. This is, as you know, when Al Mohler kind of rose up in the SBC as kind of a voice for conservatives. And so he's brought into this as, you know, a part of that. But she says, these women insisted on interpreting the biblical text contextually, attentive to the settings in which they were produced. Conservatives, however, insisted on a populist hermeneutic, a method privileging the simplest, most direct interpretation of Scripture. For conservatives, this wasn't just the right method, it was also the masculine one. Okay, so what do you get there? That's not a neutral, like, hey, let me just tell the facts and the history. You're picking a side, right? You're saying, hey, on the one side, you have these careful exegesis of the text, which leads you to a feminist egalitarian reading. And on the other hand, you have this ham-fisted, dumb conservative, reactionary, we're just going to take it as simple as we possibly can. And that's what you get. You get this, you know, like Christian patriarchy instead.
Because it's actually not very hard to like state those two sides in a more general way.
It's easy.
Right. One side privileged the extra biblical scholarship done on the cultures of the people that would lead someone to say these things. The other side, you're right, privileged a direct, attempting to do as direct of an application as possible from the text.
Yep.
Right. Like,
and
that's me in like 5 seconds coming up with a way.
No, it's that simple. But obviously, again, this is a work of activism. It's a deeply subversive work. It is a piece of propaganda that's supposed to make you feel bad if you are a white evangelical and want to specifically vote in a certain way. Honestly, like it makes you like, it's supposed to make you want to vote in a certain way that you have not been, and potentially, you know, think certain things about the roles of women in your church. But I just want to. This was one of my favorite quotes in the area of like, you know, the roles of men and women. And, you know, there was a lot about like how you raise boys and how, you know, they were, you know, boys were being inculcated in these really like militant virtues. And she quotes this guy, Jack Hiles, who I don't know. He was apparently a fundamentalist mega church pastor. He sounded, I think, like not a great dude. And, you know, what he believed maybe wasn't great. So I'm not like defending him completely. But one of the like really bad things that she pulls out that this guy said, you know, is that he, quote, bought his own son a pair of boxing gloves when he was 5, an air rifle at 13, and a 22 at 15. And I was like, I honestly was just like, man, that sounds pretty reasonable.
That poor kid must have not been responsible if he wasn't allowed to have a rifle. A rifle at 15. Sorry, son, you don't get you still can't have a real gun.
I know. I actually, you know, my boys who are 6 and 4 have already shot an air rifle. You know, they don't like carry it around without dad yet, but yeah, like that, it just sounded like there were things like this that, yes, are there ham-fisted ways to talk about the differences between men and women? Sure. Do people fall into them all the time? Yep. That's like, of course. Does that mean that men and women are, you know, exactly the same, are interchangeable? Obviously not. You know, like that is to go too far. Yeah. But this is a very, like, again, very common trope. She paints in a bad light what would be simply historic Christian understandings of the roles of men and women, as well as just the nature of men and women, the differences between us.
One of the genius things about this thesis of this militant masculinity is any attack or criticism of this book is a proof of the thesis. You're attacking this book because you're defending militant masculinity, just like me laboring to take apart a plastic playhouse in the street so I could get my kids home for dinner finally. David, is there any overarching like bad? I mean, we've talked about the history, we've talked about the exact backwards reading of the sociological causation. Is there any other bad you want to point out before we get to the ugly, where I'll just ask you guys if you want to share one of the most wild claims in it before we let our people go?
I just wanted to, if she thinks men and guns are the things that go together, she hasn't been to Texas. There's some ladies here that own more ammo and shoot more rounds than any dude I know.
Probably more than me. Probably a lot more than me, I'm sure.
No, okay, sorry. About joke over. So any other bad thing about the book? I kind of have a hard time knowing where the bad ends and the ugly begins.
Sure.
Yeah, it is hard.
So I will say, so one of the things I will say that's bad is I think she should have known better.
Okay.
She comes from Iowa. She's raised in Iowa. Right. Okay. That's not exactly light on evangelical influence. Okay. This is a people that I think she could have portrayed more compassionately or more fairly or more objective. Pick your adjective. I think she could have done that. And I also think that she, like, the things that disproved her thesis were right under her nose. And I don't think that she actually wanted to see them. And you kind of see this bleeding through. Let me just quote something real quick from her introduction where I she should have seen this bleeding through. She's talking about, this is the place where she goes back to, she sees the Trump rally in Iowa at Dordt College in Sioux Center, her hometown. Okay. She says, I'd grown up a short walk from campus on the other side of the old farmstead, only recently converted back to native prairie. Okay. So I'm going to be a good deconstructionist. So I'm going to read at the margins here. So she should appreciate this. Okay. Why is that old farmstead converted back to prairie? Because that town is probably disintegrating, because that town is no longer a thriving agricultural place. Like, this town is dissipating before her eyes, but she doesn't even see that. Like, maybe there's some connection between that old farmstead no longer being in use and Trump now being there. And again, like I said, I'm saying this sort of tongue in cheek, No. But this is the kind of thing I think she should have been able to pick up on.
That definitely shows up. I think that one of the things that I find a little bit gross about this kind of book is how it comes across, especially in the introduction, as I can't believe those stupid rubes that I grew up around would vote for Trump. Like, it's just a throwing under the bus of your neighbors from when you grew up. And honestly reads a little bit like liberal friends in the academy and in these urban centers, please don't look down on me because I grew up around those people. And it's just like, it just comes across as gross. Like, just, it would take very little for you to understand why a majority of people in a place like Iowa might feel more comfortable voting for Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton. It would take so little empathy. These people are all about empathy. Use a little bit of empathy, right? You don't have to be all about Trump. I actively try to convince people not to vote for Trump. And I was,
you don't have to
successful.
Vote for Trump either. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like in 2016, I did end up voting for him when he lost. So I don't know if I don't know if it was on me, but
even worse.
So I wasn't like super like, hey, like everything has to be about Trump, but it would take zero, like not zero, just the tiniest little sliver of empathy to understand why these people would feel the way that they did. And instead you're like, there is no way to explain how they voted for Trump, except to say that there have been these deeply nefarious beliefs about making women these slaves in a way to male desire, and making those of a different ethnic background, those who are now going to be under my boot, and all these nefarious,
So,
I'm going to take power over you motivations.
Though for better or worse, the stereotype of who Trump is, that he marries
right.
supermodels because he's a servant. And again, there's truth to these stereotypes, and there's a lot of it that's overplayed, that he marries supermodels because he is controlled by base desires and he doesn't like foreigners, right? Like but what is interesting, even again, David, and what you said was, look at this farmhouse, because let's say that farmland is still being used. Well, it's actually not being used by whatever family used to do that. So even if it is, even if the community is healthy, having friends, and Sioux City lovers, if you want to, you guys can clap back at David. You can send him if Sioux City is a beautiful place. But what it regardless gets at is, hey, that something in the last 50 years, and maybe even less time, if this is her living memory, something in that community has been transformed. And that's reflective of almost, especially all small towns across the Midwest and in lots of places in the South.
Yeah, and I'm sure, like you said, they can clap back. They can tell me that this was a world successful environmental reclamation project, and I'll concede the point. Fine. Sure. In this one case, you're right. But the examples of where that is the case in the small towns throughout the upper Midwest, the South, the Midwest are legion. You do not have to look far to find them.
Yeah. So this has gotten to the ugly. I will say the one thing it causes me to do is, our show is critical of backgrounds we come from. And I do not want to get to this point where I have no love for the people I come from.
And we actively try, right? We want to, like, this is why we always say we want to try to have gratitude, even where we cross the line into the place where we are complaining too much, or we're maybe being more unfair than we should be. We want to have some kind of gratitude, which is why we even start a review like this and saying, hey, there's more good. I've got multiple pages of things that I listed under, hey, these are things that I actually think are positive or good about this book.
But that's not where we're going now, Pastor.
No, it's not.
Now we're going to we're going to spend the last couple minutes. You guys can just entertain me with the ugly, or what is just either whether is beyond belief, whatever you define ugly, however you choose, and share some of the.
One correction. People from Sioux City, I'm sure, can call in, but it's actually Sioux Center.
Oh,
so I said it wrong. My mistake. So my mea culpa.
Sorry, everyone. We didn't mean to throw you under the bus. So I want to take two kind of primary elements of what I would think of as the ugly. And for me, the ugly is that, again, this is a subversive work of propaganda. It is not history. And maybe I want Brad to come on and defend a good view of sociology sometime, because I'm tending to just see sociology as that, as like a subversive propaganda. So Brad, you can dissuade me from that sometime if you would like. But two main things that I want to cover. Number one is what I would refer to as the framing, and I've already brought this up with a few points. And second is what I'm going to call conspiracy theory hermeneutics. So first, like with framing, again, she makes lists of things or puts things alongside of each other that do not belong in the same category. This is maybe due to just trying to simplify things, right? So sometimes everybody does this, where we try to simplify things, whether for good or ill, in a way that it meshes categories that do not belong together. But she does so in a way that I think is unconscionable, honestly. So let me give two maybe primary examples. So one is where she is trying to point out those who have been known for abuses of power within the church. And so she makes a list of people and what they've done. And this is near the end of the book. I want to say it was the last chapter, where most of the book is look at all these people that have abused power, look at all these people in the church involved in sexual abuse, look at all these, it just is lists of like some of the horrible things that a lot of the people she's named up to this point throughout the book have done. So she, for instance, she brings up, lo and behold, Mark Driscoll and the, kind of toppling of Mars Hill, and the fact that so many, around him did not take responsibility. But men like John Piper said, I have no regrets. And Doug Wilson said that he still liked Mark Driscoll after this all happened. And so like, okay, like here's one of these situations. Interesting to note, by the way, she quotes Ed Stetzer in a favorable light as trying to persuade people not to vote for Trump, making she uses the phrase that he made a last ditch effort to try to convince people not to sell their souls in a vote for Donald Trump. So he's painted in a good light, doesn't mention him when talking about those who supported Mark Driscoll, but whatever.
And Ed Stetzer, just to be clear, is not a government asset, everyone. So I can make that clear every time we talk about him.
We want to make that absolutely clear. We'd love to have you on the show, Mr. Stetzer.
I would have one pretty direct question.
Yeah.
Perhaps about government.
If you are a government agent. So Mark Driscoll, she mentions C.J. Mahaney and everything that went down with him and his church, and what seems from the outside as possibly, some kind of cover up of abuse. Again, is that what happened? I don't know, but that's what she quotes. She lists Darren Patrick, who was removed from his church for domineering and manipulative leadership. Then at the end of this list of those who had used their power to abuse, she throws in John MacArthur. And the reason she puts in John MacArthur is because his school was written up by their accrediting agency for having not put into place certain practices that would fit with some kind of law that was called like the Protection of Women Act or something like that. Now, that's really all it says, right? It doesn't say a lot. It just says this accrediting agency wrote up the school that's under him. Number one, that's a little bit different, right? Obviously, he's got ties to it. I'm not going to fully defend it because I don't know the full situation. But like, this is one of those things that it would be very easy to see how an accrediting agency, which very often skew in a more progressive direction, are trying to get the school to put into place some kind of policy directed by some kind of California law that, what kind of discrimination laws do you think come out of California? Are they all good? No, they're not. So again, it's not to say that, John MacArthur has done no wrong. It's to say that when you put that in the same category as these people that have been removed from ministry or have their churches implode, that it skews weird, right? Like it's framing it in a different light. Now, what I think is even worse is she begins talking about those who were directly involved in sexual abuse or very clear sexual abuse cover-ups. She mentions,
all the same chapter. This is all the same thing.
Yeah, it is. It's all
wow.
It's all the same list. It's all the same.
All the same list, and it's horrifying, right? So again, just to go back to where we might say there's something to learn from this book. This was happening a lot, and it's frightening to see some of these really well-known names who were involved in some of these cover-ups, right? So this is, she puts in, Bill Gothard and, some of the stuff that he did or covered up, the Duggar family. I want to say that there were other, I can't remember the guy, the Vision Forum guy, Doug Phillips. Him, and so she puts this list of people who did actually perpetrated sexual abuse. And then alongside of that list, she includes John Piper for one time during an Ask John, when he was asked how long a woman should stay in a marriage when the man is becoming more abusive. And he said something that was maybe stupid, where he said something to the effect of, and again, this is where you'll do the quotes where it's like, here's a partial quote, ... ellipses, here's another part of the quote. So I don't know the full context. But he said something to the effect of, what she quotes, maybe you should stay for some harsh words, put up with some harsh words, if he smacks you around a little bit, eventually, obviously you go get help. But in the context, my guess is John Piper is trying to say, we want to find a way to preserve this marriage, right? To heal this marriage, to help this marriage, to not allow it to end in divorce. He maybe said something in a really an unhelpful way in a public setting that wasn't ideal. but he is listed among those who personally perpetrated abuse or cover up of sexual abuse.
Sure.
That is not the same thing. But of course, you have to do that because you're trying to tie all of these things that have gone before as if they're one and the same with that same like complementarian evangelical leadership today. They're all the same. That's what she's trying to say, right? And so it's just like there are so many examples of that kind of framing. So I'll let you react to that, and then I want to talk about the conspiracy theory hermeneutics as well.
So yeah, David, what do you think about that? Or at least add, if you want to add your own an ugly thing to it before Pastor Michael gets to conspiracy theories.
Yeah, so I mean, like to me, one of the more ugly things of the book is, in some sense, this book is kind of an apologetic. Unapologetic. I don't make it too strong. I'm trying to say this in the most tactful way possible so that I don't get in trouble.
We appreciate it.
In the end, I think the reader is left to feel unsympathetic and uncaring for evangelicals. Okay. And if you think about it, that's a pretty ugly thing for a book to do, to point at a group of people and say, these people are pretty bad. In some sense, they've gotten what they've deserved. And we can explain the bad things that happen to them by their bad behavior. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess, you can bring up a story, nobody's going to shed a tear over the Nazis. You can bring up the obvious historical examples of people that uniformly behaved badly. Although I'm sure there's some Germans who, were forced along. I'm not going to defend that. But yeah, you kind of get the feeling that, yeah, these people, like, they get what's coming to them. What happens to them is kind of deserved. Now, I don't know that she feels that. I don't know that that's her intention, but that's kind of what you get left with at the end.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it absolutely comes across that way.
Because guess what? Here's the harsh reality. Hey, Trump voters need Jesus too. I mean, right? If I'm doing a biblical analysis, maybe they did. Let me grant they did a lot of things wrong. Let me grant they have what's coming to them. Let me grant they're causing all the problems. And obviously, we shouldn't grant any of those things based on the hour-long conversation we've had. But even if I did, the answer is Trump voters need Jesus too. And even if they think, and even the idea that they have a form of religion that would be problematic would not prevent us from thinking that way. But that is what it is, right? At the end of the day. And trying to create a distance from that is ugly. You're right. So Michael, tell us about why this book is, and now TGC has warned me a lot about conspiracy theories and anyone who propagates them. And so I'm really concerned about this as well. So tell me why this is conspiratorial thinking.
I am also against wrong thing. Thank you, TGC. Yep. So what I mean by conspiracy theory hermeneutics, I've spent some time going down conspiracy theory rabbit holes because I find them fascinating. What you find within conspiracy theories, like actual conspiracy theories, right? So you think about like the flat earth conspiracy theory, right? It is on its face absurd, like it's, sure. You just ask the question, who benefits from this?
Right.
Who's like, who's making money? What, I don't even get,
Flat earth homeschool families, we love you. You can keep listening to the show with your family.
There are conspiracies that, like, I'm willing to say that might have some credibility. There are conspiracies that have turned out to be true. There are some that it's like, I don't even get why this would, like, I don't get why this would matter, I guess.
Right.
But when you, listen to any of these people that are going down this conspiracy theory rabbit hole, right? You choose an idea and then you have to fit evidence into it. And how you do that is you connect unrelated things, or you connect things that you can draw a line to and from, but there are plenty of other explanations for why you might be able to draw that line, rather than just like, obviously they prove this they've come out of this particular point. So, I don't know, maybe an example, if it's like a pattern recognition thing, right? So, if every day that I see Matt come into the church and he's wearing a black t-shirt, something bad happened to me, if I start saying, well, like the reason something bad happens to me is because Matt comes in with this black shirt on, like he must be doing something nefarious because it's always this same thing that happens. It's just like there are plenty of other reasons why these other things might have happened. And the thing about conspiracy theories, including Jesus and John Wayne, is that the real world is way more complicated than you chalk it up to be. There are so many other reasons for why things play out the way they do than what you can even categorize in something like this. This is why it's important when you read history, when you read sociology, when you read anything, to read broadly, because there's not one reason that the Roman Empire fell. Right. There are all kinds of different contingencies and individual people's stories that led up into like the big narrative. And like the world is complicated and people are complicated. It takes very little imagination to think of other reasons why some things might be connected. But what you have to do in order to prove a point when it's a conspiracy theory is connect things that might not otherwise be connected. So there are a lot of sly moves that are kind of made in order to do this, I think, in this book, because she set herself out to connect the ideas of this, white Christian nationalist patriarchy, like militant masculine kind of movement, right? Like all these things have to be connected. So you have to find a way to peg evangelicals in each of these categories. Let me give an example of one. She talks about Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly was like a notable Roman Catholic, popular, female conservative.
Schlafly, I believe.
Schlafly. Did I? Okay.
Yep. Sorry.
I missed an L.
Yeah.
So Phyllis Schlafly. I'm not going to say her name a lot because it's difficult. So she says a lot about Phyllis, which is, she was a popular conservative figure that spoke to evangelicals many times. But at one point she says this, listen to this. She says, in an era when race was increasingly discussed through coded language, her, talking about Phyllis Schlafly, her ideas were embraced by the same communities opposed to civil rights. Did you hear that? Right. So like there is no direct, like, okay, here is what Phyllis Schlafly believed or taught. It's, look, the communities that believe these two things were overlapping. Now, obviously there's no footnote on that, because how do you footnote that?
Sure.
Right. How do you prove that historically? You can't, right? There's no way to directly prove that. Now she continues, she says, she quotes from another, like some politician of the time, some Democratic politician, saying conservatives didn't talk about desegregation and busing, but they were clearly seething inside with anger, and that came out with the Equal Rights Amendment. Again, you're connecting things, like you're making assumptions about personal intentions, and you have to connect these things. You have to connect patriarchy with racism, with these like evangelical personas. But you notice how they did that. These things are not naturally connected, but you have to find a way to do it. Another way that she did it, I noticed this a handful of times throughout the book. She would use the phrase "in this way," which I just made note of when I would find it, because it was a way to connect things that otherwise may not have been directly connected. So, for instance, she talks about Bill Gothard and some of the stuff that he came up with, and his, I don't know, he had a lot of different things that he did, which were a mess, by the way. I'm not going to defend Bill Gothard at all. But at one point, she tries to connect a lot of evangelical ideas of government to R.J. Rushdoony and the Reconstructionist movement. Now, I was actually surprised with how much Reconstructionists actually made it into some of these like inner circles of political like activists on the evangelical right. That was actually interesting to me, because I thought they were a lot more obscure, and I still think they're more obscure than she makes them out to be. I think she made them out to be much more influential than they actually were. But she would say something like, for instance, in this way, Gothard's philosophy built on the Christian deconstructionist teaching of Rushduni. And she would do that by simply connecting either words or phrases or like similar concepts, right? Hey, we both believe that there should be an authority figure in the home. In this way, he built upon this previous foundation. Well, that's not necessarily building upon the same foundation. It's not necessarily that they're working together in some kind of concerted effort, right? There are plenty of other reasons why somebody might come to those conclusions. But again, when you start with that conspiracy theory, you have to fit all of these things together in a coherent pattern. Otherwise, it all falls apart. The reality is that it's much more complicated. We can sit here and say, here are some of the bad things people said and did. Here's some of the good things. Here's some of that came directly from the Bible or Christian tradition. Here are some of the things that didn't, and there's sociological or cultural reasons why that might have happened. Here's all the many different reasons why maybe somebody would have voted for Trump instead of just these, like, it clearly came right out of their theological understanding of militant masculinity. You know, like it takes very little empathy and very little imagination to get to that place. And again, this is why I say it's a subversive work. It's a work of propaganda. I don't know if she believes these things. She probably does. That's, you know, like, this is a lot of it was typical talking points that you're going to hear from what is the more kind of progressive element within the Christian world right now, that at least the kind of, you know, popular talking points. Nonetheless, it still is subversive. It is still trying to get people to agree to something that they otherwise wouldn't, by appealing to the fact that a lot of these bad things took place. And look, maybe you don't want to be lumped in with these bad guys.
So David, yeah, what do you think about this? This almost sounds like the causation you were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah. So, like, let's take another obvious one where I can give an example of where she draws lines that could be drawn in many alternate and equally convincing or even more convincing ways. So, front and center, John Wayne. John Wayne makes surprisingly little appearances in the book.
Yeah,
like, it's really, it's let me see if I can find it real quick. It's really only one quote. Now I will. Do you want me to just say it? There's an off-color word. That is in the King James Bible, but
we can do it.
Okay, in the words of Baptist scholar Alan Bean, the unspoken mantra of post-war evangelicalism was simple: Jesus can save your soul, but John Wayne will save your ass. Okay, that's one of the only appearances that John Wayne makes in the book. Okay,
wow.
Now, do evangelicals like John Wayne? Probably. Okay, but is that because evangelicals tend to live in the Midwest and the South and the upper Midwest, and people that live there like John Wayne more than, say, New Yorkers or Seattle, people living in Seattle do? I mean, there's a very simple alternate explanation that might account for using John Wayne however he is used, though she doesn't really show the use of him that much in evangelical culture, evangelical speak. But just right there, maybe that accounts for. And I don't know. Okay, I can already hear the accusation. Now you're devolving into whataboutism.
Sure.
But I'm not really, because I'm just saying, like, okay, if we're going to have an explanation as to why John Wayne may or may not be popular among evangelicals, I can use religion to explain it. I can use geography to explain it. I can use occupation to explain it.
Yep.
You have to give me evidence to choose for one over the other. And the book doesn't do that. It just draws the line: John Wayne, evangelical, masculinity, bam, done.
Yeah, no, she actually, by the way, this is just a little offshoot. She does literally use the phrase at one time, conservatives pounced, which I thought was hilarious, because that's a kind of common trope on conservative, like, you know, it's a conservative talking point that when, you know, liberals tell the story, they don't tell what actually happened. They talk about how conservatives pounced. They reacted in a way.
Right.
And so it's just funny to hear her actually use that phrase. But So John Wayne, there's no substantive way that John Wayne shows up at all. John Wayne, she somehow found several different quotes from some of these people. I think Phyllis Schlafly and, you know, for sure Ronald Reagan talking about him, and like several people that talk about
neither of them are evangelical. Neither of them are evangelical.
No, yeah, I don't think right. I don't think they were. And so people use the name John Wayne, like, just talking, which is like, yeah, like when you have all these like sermons and and like speeches and things like that. And John Wayne is one of the most popular people
It's 1960.
in the country.
I'm thinking of a cowboy.
Yeah, right.
John
It's
Wayne.
So
Yeah.
there's no substantive way. It's just that John Wayne becomes a picture of like rugged masculine patriotism that she then ties to basically this is what evangelicals believe too, right? Like they believed that is the ideal model for what a man should be. And so that's what it was. It wasn't substantive though. Again, you see that this is a conspiracy theory kind of hermeneutic, right? It ties things together that there's plenty of other reasons for.
Yeah.
And I just point out, like you said, if she can't find an evangelical saying it, she will find a person evangelicals like and say good enough.
Right.
Okay. Like here's another thing. Like most of the modern American political conservatism, the stuff that comes out of National Review, evangelicals were not there. They're latecomers to that party. Yep. That's mostly Roman Catholic and Jewish thought. And I'm not saying that it makes it good or bad. Those are just the people that were there. So when you get Phyllis Schlafly, when you get these early conservatives, they're almost to a man and woman, not evangelical, but evangelicals will later come to appreciate them. And therefore we can baptize what they said as evangelical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure.
This,
if you want more on this, David's completely right. Aaron Wrenn covers the history of the conservative movement. It's inarguable.
I was going to bring that up. Yep.
Yeah. It's inarguable what David is saying about this. And because we have traditionally, and even if evangelicals couldn't always articulate this, we have an idea of a two kingdoms where if there's a group of people who can oppose abortion with us in our community, it is okay in certain ways to partner with them. Now, what I think is really interesting about this, when I think about John Wayne, and I think we said this when in just a promo of this, I never heard about John Wayne in church growing up. That had nothing to do with my spirituality, who I was supposed to be as a man at all. And if that happened to you, it's, to be honest, not the worst thing. Obviously, John Wayne was not a believer and did not really exhibit Christian virtue, whatever. But it's worse things have happened to people, is what I'm saying, is even if that was imposed on you. You know who loved John Wayne in my life? My grandmas. I'm just wondering if the actual affinity people had of John Wayne's is from like 1940 to like 1980. Westerns were just really popular in America. And so it was just popular. It was just it wasn't it wasn't an evangelical thing. It was just a thing. And it now looks a little bit strange to us because for whatever reason, I mean, just like superhero movies weren't popular then, Westerns aren't popular now. Right. And so again, that's me drawing a different line, but I had a Roman Catholic grandmother and a grandmother who later in life converted to a form of evangelical Christianity. They both love John Wayne.
Yep.
I don't know what that says about them, but
it does. It just seemed like he was popular. And I should say, by the way, I've actually watched several Westerns since reading this book, in part because I was like, I should watch some of these. So this is how I want to end. Okay. I don't think we should end on just a negative note. So I ended all of my notes with 5 things that I feel like I've learned from this book. And this is where I would like to end. And I want your reactions, your thoughts about each of these 5. So here are my 5 things that I learned from Jesus and John Wayne. Number 1, there were a lot of really prominent women in the patriarchy movement, evidently.
Okay.
There were, tons of very prominent, well-known women who were a part of this movement that was apparently unbelievably harsh toward women. So I don't know what you want to do with that, but it's something that I learned.
Yeah, I really want to know what you do with Maribel Morgan.
Should we talk? Let's just talk about Maribel Morgan.
Let's
do it. I think we should. I think what we should do is we're just going to keep going. And this can be the review. We don't have to come back to this. We don't have to do an extra one. And I will save my notes. And if we ever want to come back for a patrons event or something, we can just pull out a quote and discuss it, because it's a lot of great material for later, or a quick bonus episode or something.
Sure.
If we have to go daily again,
Morgan,
we'll pull some out.
I can describe Maribel Morgan in one sentence.
All right.
She is the 1960s Mark Driscoll.
Wow.
That's
Wow.
hilarious. That's really interesting.
When it comes to sex.
Yeah.
To sex.
Yep. So Maribel Morgan was apparently, I had never heard her name before, by the way.
Me neither.
Evidently, she was very popular according to this book. I don't remember how many book sales she had, but she lists how many book sales she had. This is a woman who was evidently in the evangelical world, who wrote a book about what it looks like to be a good wife. So some of the things, by the way, she wrote that are listed again amongst the like kind of negative bad things were like seemed like they're not like horrible things. They sound horrible today. You know, so she talks a lot about, hey, you should try to lose some weight and look nice for your husband. That's not the worst thing in the world to say, right? I don't think that that's a horrible thing to say. It's, you know, it
as it says in the Song of Songs. Is
right.
Is that how the Driscoll connection came?
Yeah, right. No, I don't know. She
No.
She talks about practical
there's a stronger
things.
connection. Yeah.
Yeah, she talks about practical things, right? Like, hey, this is like some ideas for like healthy meal prep and like how to make sure you have like, you know, meals ready. Obviously, that sounds horrible to progressive ears. For a wife that wants to like, you know, please her husband, like I know plenty of women who like ask those kinds of questions, right? Like, oh, I wonder what a good, helpful way to like, you know, get dinner on the table at a reasonable time is, and like while trying to balance all these other things, you know, it's very reasonable. Now, then all of a sudden, like, it just seems like, you know, there's these things that seem, okay, they're kind of innocent, you know, maybe they sound horrible today. And then apparently she also had things like, you should be dressing up in a different sexy costume every day to meet your husband at the door.
That is expensive.
Yeah, I was like, it was very clearly. So apparently a bunch of, what was it? It was, I think it was the Miami Dolphins. Apparently I think it was the Dolphins. This was a year when several of the like player wives from this NFL team, if it wasn't the Dolphins, it was someone else. They all went to one of Maribel Morgan's seminars. And that year, after having done that year, that team won every single game.
Yeah, perfect season. Yeah,
that was
the perfect season.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure it was the Dolphins' perfect season. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to say, I guess I have a suggestion. If you want fantastical, unrepeatable success in your life.
Oh man, so that's weird. Now, here's one of the things about Maribel Morgan. She then, after saying that, right, she says, here's this woman who says you need to dress up in a different sexy costume to meet your husband at the door each day. Which for any like, you know, Proverbs 31, like biblical wife, I'm just going to like have a productive household is obviously absurd and weird, you know, like, and expensive and like just, and like, do you not have any children?
Right.
You know, like what, like, how do you, anyway, like she is then listed right after that. Boom. Elizabeth Elliot.
Oh no.
This is how she frames it. Elizabeth Elliot. Boom. Like she's so similar to Maribel Morgan. All right. I'll let you do with that what you will. But this is what I learned, that there are a lot of prominent women in this patriarchy movement.
So women had a voice in the production of militant masculinity.
Pretty significant. And even to the point that I believe it was Beverly LaHaye sat on like a presidential council, some council for Ronald Reagan. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah. Was it Council on the Family or something like that?
Something like that. Yeah. So like I mean, that's pretty significant, major role in, you know, in politics.
I have decided that here's something I'm learning. I'm going to write a book called The Dispensationalists in John Wayne and write a very interesting book with that premise.
That could be interesting. All right. Number two. Let me get to number two. Number two. Apparently, we have all forgotten about the plethora of female CEOs and heads of state before they all got removed in the Cold War to make evangelical men who were anxious about their masculinity feel better about themselves. I don't even remember writing that, but that's what I wrote for number two.
Except Margaret Thatcher. Except notable hero of the Cold War, Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, of course. Margaret Thatcher's mentioned, I believe, actually.
Oh, sure.
At one point.
Well, there's another one. If you're going to go the dispensationalist route, dispensationalists are big boosters of the state of Israel. And I believe Golda Meir was one of the first female heads of state in the world.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's definitely true. Yeah.
She does. There is a quote at one point that I noticed that it's something like, you know, the boom after World War II, allowed men to become the sole breadwinners. And it just made it sound like, before this, men and women were all out in the workforce, and it was like, and their kids were in daycare, and it's just like this weird, like, I don't think this is quite what you actually see beforehand.
It's a weird, yes, industrialization totally changed family dynamics, and we've talked about it. I mean, in some ways we've talked about it as negatively.
Yep.
But again, when you're doing this, like, so what, this is one of the insane things, and this is done so often, is the idea that Billy Graham, or I mean, go back much further, right? Any of the, like, the idea that you can like easily put John Calvin into a box of a person that, like, he would just sit here, is a weird take. And when you're like, the family structures were just like this. No, they were brutal in the 1800s.
Yeah, it was just
yeah. Anyways,
it's just weird,
Give me number 3.
Weird. She makes a really interesting point, by the way, about about how something like changed in men basically when they were no longer like on their own land working with their hands, but instead went into work for somebody else and were completely dependent upon like a corporation. And I thought, whoa, that could be an actually really interesting point to like talk about. It didn't go anywhere from there. I just thought, whoa, that's actually like an interesting concept to deal with. Anyway, number 3. Number 3, presidents should have different pastors than just Billy Graham. They should have their own pastor, and it shouldn't be Billy Graham every time. And that's what it's been, up until recently. Now I will give you this. Billy Graham, significantly better spiritual advisor than Trump's spiritual advisor, who was Paula White.
yeah, that was a notably, that was one of the ways where it was like, Trump doesn't actually totally understand evangelicals. He's like, this person, this is who they like. It's like, no, total miss.
Well, yeah, didn't he quote his favorite Bible verses coming from 2 Corinthians?
Yep. 2 Corinthians.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Isn't there a famous book about Billy Graham's relationships with the presidents?
Yeah, so I've read this. It's called The Preacher and the Presidents. It's a really interesting book, and it really shaped how I view things. This is why a book like Jesus and John Wayne can actually gain some traction, because I do think that popular evangelical figures appeared to have significantly more influence than you would expect in the political arena. But what you actually see, I think, is that you have somebody like Billy Graham who clearly had political aspirations in some way. Like, he loved being at the center of power, and like his personality was really big, and he loved being at that place, right? He loved that world leaders were calling him. But almost exclusively, you find out in that book, he was being used by the politician in order to get elected, because they knew that he understood evangelicals. That was, that's what you really find out. But it is fascinating. I'd recommend reading it if you are interested in this kind of thing. I found that a far more interesting historical read than, say, Jesus and John Wayne. That is much more an actual work of history, just straightforward history.
Yep. All right.
Number 4. This one, I don't know how to exactly categorize it, but basically the religious right were right about a lot of things. They were right about a lot of things. A lot of the stuff they were attempting and trying to push for were actually good things. We've been hard on the religious right. They had problems. I'm not defending them across the board, but I came away from this book thinking that maybe one of the reasons that people are so hard on the religious right today, especially from, say, a perspective like this book, is actually because they actually accomplished things. They were good at what they did. They got their people involved pretty high up in political office, and they actually changed laws by their lobbying efforts. And I think that was actually, I think the reason that people have been so hard on them is not just because some of the stuff they believed was a little wacky and problematic, which it was. But I think the reason that a lot of people like Kristin Dumez are probably hard on the religious right is because they are a threat to the current kind of political machine.
David, tell us tell us you're not a Neanderthal and concluded that the religious right was right about a lot of things.
Well, I mean, the religious right said a lot of things.
Yeah.
So
Right.
you say enough things, you're gonna have some right, some wrong. Where I would push back is I don't think that they were actually all that politically successful. So I guess I'll go ahead and dissent from that last one. I think to a large degree they were, and Dumez even admits this at certain points, that they were largely used much in the same way Billy Graham was used.
Yeah.
They're used as a voting bloc, but they're not really given much in return for their vote. And that kind of becomes the almost like the through line of the religious right. Like, even if you take, like, if I had to say when was the religious right most successful, I would say between 2002, 2008. I don't know if you remember, but that was when there was every state in the United States had ballot initiatives on gay marriage,
On the
legalization.
Yep.
Right. And the centerpiece of George W. Bush's 2004, well, not his centerpiece, but a large, like, they made sure a lot of those ballot measures happened in 2004. Okay. Karl Rove has, basically said, this is our get out the vote, thing. And, George W. Bush, merrily, got reelected up until Prop 8 in 2008, which was kind of the high watermark when gay marriage was made illegal in the state of California. If you can believe that, in 2008, Californians voted majority for traditional marriage. But ever since then, like, every single thing that was accomplished at that point has been completely wiped out and annihilated.
Yeah.
Okay. Like 100%. Like, none of that was permanent whatsoever. And there's, if George W. Bush, I don't think was very, let's just say I doubt his sincerity in supporting those things. He liked it to get elected, but I don't think he was very sincere on those measures. But I just give that as an example of, even when they're successful, it tends to be temporary and it tends to be wiped away later.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you're convincing. I think you've convinced me to soften what I would say, but I will maintain like the religious right were right about a lot of things. That I'll maintain that.
And what I think it, again, even when David talked about voting patterns, the people were not sympathetic to I just vote Republican every time, which is basically, I would say, a pretty fair understanding of how a lot of evangelicals treated voting. And why did they do that? Because there were things that were clearly aligned with what the word of God taught. Marriage would be one example, but much nearer to their heart, things like abortion, right? Things about end of life issues. And it was, one party is going to fight against this with all they can. This party says they support me. Oftentimes they don't, as David is pointing out accurately. So that's what I do, right? Like, there wasn't tons of passion about it. Now, some people were very passionate about it, and they would do campaigning, they would do work, but it was kind of, and again, that might be why the religious right was not successful, because the block they had said, okay, I'll listen to you and I'll show up on that Tuesday in November, but I don't really want to do anything the rest of the year, right? But that this practice isn't insane. It's a fairly rational, whether or not you agree with it or not, it's a pretty rational perspective that I'll get what I get out of this. This is the best I can do. Straight card, like, that's not thoughtful. Yeah, I get it, but whatever. All right, but that's enough. Pastor Michael, take
Number
us
5. Here we go. What I was left with reading this book was that we need fathers. We need fathers. We need we need, like, men generally, but we really need fathers. So many of the issues that arose that were then placed into the hands of, like, these big evangelical names to fix through politics, through lobbying, to fix through, James Dobson coming out with another book about how to raise children. So many of these things came about because of a lack of fathers in the home, fathers in the church. who were going to like discipline and care for and love their families, both biological and in the Christian community more broadly. And maybe my encouragement would then be that you don't let people like those writing books like this shame you out of doing that. It would be a shame if many people read this and thought, yeah, I guess it would be bad of me to take responsibility and seek to protect and provide for my wife and children. You know, like that is, this is actually what we need most right now. And if you want to try to avoid the pitfalls, the many pitfalls that show up throughout this book, I'm not saying that like, you know, being a father like cures you of all those things. Obviously, many of the men who committed some of the things that she talks about were fathers, but to like actually seek to be a father in light of what the scripture teaches, right? To actually take on responsibility and to love in the way that a father is to love. In that way, you know, reflecting God the Father. This is something that I think we really need.
Thank you for listening to this, the definitive review of Jesus and John Wayne. It will never be done again. And
it was long. It was long, man. You know, if you sat through it, good on you. It's a mega episode.
Thank you, Pastor Michael. Thank you, David, for coming back again. And I am sure there will be more useful reviewing we can do in the future,
man. And there's so much more. Hey, if you want to see more, I'm going to stick all the notes that I made, the 12 pages of notes I have, including basically a breakdown of each chapter and kind of the main points and thesis of each chapter and other, you know, ideas or thoughts I had. I'm not going to guarantee they're great or good. But if you want to see more, I'm going to put that behind the paywall in our Patreon so that people can see it there.